Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyegulu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, the subject of race in the UK has been hitting the news recently, following a controversial report by the British Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which found that social class and family structure had a bigger impact than race on how people's lives turned out in Britain. The report even argued that the UK should be regarded as a model of race relations for other white majority countries. But speak to black people in Britain and they'll tell you that the review failed to reflect their true experiences. We'll speak to one such campaigner and social commentator. And later, Colombia, the latest cockpit of chaos in Latin America, where deadly anti-government protests are threatening to spiral out of control, fueled by outrage over a tax plan. But amid the deaths of more than 20 protesters, demands have expanded to include action to tackle police violence. So what do the Colombian protests tell us about COVID-19 and economic woes? And is it a moment of change for the country? We have analysis from our international correspondent. And later still, today we mark 40 years since the much too early death of a giant of modern reggae music, Bob Marley, who died of cancer at the age of just 36. His remarkable career is being richly marked all over the world today, but more so in his native country, Jamaica. We'll be joined by the Jamaican ambassador to Nigeria as we remember the legend and the legacy of the immortal Bob Marley. Coming up. Now, it's now nearly 60 years since Britain marked its first race relations legislation, and the subject of race has once again been hitting the newspaper headlines after the UK government published its much anticipated report at the end of March. While some papers welcomed the review, arguing that it blasted common sense into the debate and was a serious attempt to move the national conversation beyond polarization and towards practical solutions, others concluded that it failed in its task, was ignorant and downright offensive, and insulted the people it was meant to serve. But beyond the newspapers, the men and women who worked over decades to safeguard the rights and freedoms of Britain's ethnic minorities had little cause to welcome this particular exposure. For them, this latest report merely underlined the argument made by many, black and white, that despite the existence of race relations legislation for nearly 60 years, little has changed and the color of a person can still be a source of contention, even after decades of black immigration and the indisputable fact that Britain is a multiracial society. Well, the parents of my first guest today, Natalia Nicholson, are from the Windrush generation, that set of black immigrants who arrived in the UK shortly after the Second World War. So she's been keenly aware of diversity issues in Britain since she was a child, and is now a social commentator and a gold facilitator of a Google initiative called #IamRemarkable, aimed at helping underrepresented groups and opening up discussions about diversity in the UK. And Natalia Nicholson joins me now from London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. What, first of all, are your thoughts on that report's findings? Are they shared by minority ethnic communities in the UK? Because, I mean, report after report previously had cited racial inequalities in the UK, but this one was much more optimistic.
Yeah, I think optimistic is a good choice of words, but I do not think it reflects the melting pot of what you see in the United Kingdom. Having grown up in this country and being second generation, so having a feeling of not having a sense of belong, of coming from where your parents come from, in the place that you're born and you have a passport for, you're not accepted there. The report just doesn't make sense to many of us. For many of us that read it, that have experienced what it is like to live as a person in colour of the UK, the report's just not aligned with what we see, how we live, how we're accepted. It's just not a true reflection.
Let's break that report down a little bit, because basically it suggests that social class and family structure have a bigger impact on how life turns out for most people in the UK, and that although Britain is not a post-racial society, it should be regarded as a model for similar nations. Do you, as a black Brit, see nuggets of truth at all in that?
I see no truth in that. So I'm just going to say it as it is. As a 43-year-old woman that now lives in the UK, that when my parents came to this country, the government had reports that would refer to people as colour as subjects for a commonwealth that was obtained through slavery and rules enforced upon, a school system that I went to that would alienate me for having different texture hair. I remember going to work at my first job in media after graduating at 21 and being told that I couldn't have my natural hair out and it needed to be neat and tidy. I could keep going with many social examples of myself, other colleagues, and other stories. And I'm sure if we trawled around the internet or we had a phone in, there'd be a lot of people that would have a lot to say. So to turn around and say it's an example and to whitewash the past of how it's treated people of colour, how it was for my dad who came into this country and went to school for teachers to tell him what is it like to live in the jungle with lions. This is a reality that's actually happened in my lifetime, in my parents' lifetime. And we get to 2021 and all of a sudden you wrote all your rights wrong and you feel no need to comment on the treatment of the colour of people and how they're being suppressed, but can turn around and say it's down to their social economic environment. We can talk a lot if we want about post-traumatic trauma. What about the post-traumatic trauma of the Windrush generation and what people of colour have been through the years of slavery, coming out of slavery, countries getting their independence and living in the UK? To not acknowledge that feels like a big kick in the teeth.
Yes, you've got some points there, and can I just make the point also that your camera appears to be wobbling a little bit. So if it can be steadied, that would be enormously helpful. But just again, drilling down into what you've been saying. I mean, the first race relations legislation in Britain came out in 1965, a couple of decades after the Wind generation sort of arrived there. I think what this report is saying is that it's not suggesting that there isn't racism or prejudice on an individual level. It's talking about institutional racism. Are you able to make a distinction between the two?
Yeah, you can. And the report actually doesn't really tackle institutionalized racism. It actually says that it doesn't exist when you read the whole 258-page document, and says that it's down to other elements of society. And when we talk about institutionalized racism, I just think we tend to forget that, it was okay in 1965 to say no dogs, no blacks, or no Irish. It was okay to use language that was very degrading and made people feel less than human, because that's how people of colour were treated. But then you have to ask yourself that, coming from being labelled and being treated like you're less than human to being where we are today, is that okay? And you can turn around and say, well, it does institutionalized racism exist. How does the attitudes and beliefs of people within the system just disappear from 1965 to 2021, where we are now? When we look at the police system and the racism that we've seen in the police system, we look at things like Stephen Lawrence. How do we go from the racism that existed in institutions throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, and many examples that we can have of incidents have happened, to 20 years later of it just not existing? it just doesn't make sense socially that values, attitudes, and beliefs that would have existed so strongly just a few decades ago could have just been eradicated all of a sudden, and you don't want to mention them or address them or talk about the impact that they might have had on the society.
It's interesting that the person who presided over the report is actually a black Briton. He sort of led the commission that carried out that report. But I mean, the review also finds that pay gaps are narrowing and professional diversity is increasing. Is that borne out by the facts?
No, I think that's born out of being politically correct, if you want me to be honest with you. We've reached a day and age, like I said, you can't use profanity, you can't use words that start with NIG and get away with it. There's a lot of things that you cannot describe people of colour, that be it black, Asian, and all different underrepresented nationalities, because it's considered as politically incorrect. We've watched people fall in the last decade of not being able to express themselves properly about different groups. So what's happened is institutionalized racism, and what we're experiencing now, we hide a lot behind reports like this. So unless you can prove it, it doesn't exist. But how do you prove being held down? How do you prove someone having their hand on your neck and constantly holding you down? And as a race, you can never quite get forward because you don't fit criterias, or you don't fit into, you know, the status quo of what's been set in this world, that because there's a report and it's being written by certain people, it's the fair way. Who says that? And because you can't prove something, that means automatically institutionalized racism doesn't exist. So now you have to prove people's bad attitudes. You have to, you know, prove whether someone is racist or not. You have to prove whether the system doesn't work for all underrepresented people. And to be fair, how do you do that with legislation and reports like this coming out?
Well, I have to say it's really interesting talking with you, Natalia, and I would love to speak with you some more, but I know you've got to run, and I've got to run as well. But thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us, and do come back and talk to us again. And Natalia Nicholson is a social commentator, and she was talking to me from London. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead, including Colombia, the latest flashpoint of deadly anti-government protests in Latin America that are threatening to spiral out of control. We have analysis. Stay with us.